when he was first born, and then 40 years later when he leaves the palace, and then he'll be 40 years in the wilderness, and then he'll come back and he'll walk with the children of Israel for 40 years. And so we're looking at the middle section, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24. Even though 23 starts with Moses, it's about his parents. And so we're not going to talk about Amram and Jochebed tonight. We're going to talk about Moses and what he did. And it doesn't come up in the text, but it's so important to say the faith of Moses is so solid. Where in the world did he come up with the ability to make the kind of choices he made? And it can't be anything other than the blessing of his parents. I'm just so convinced that they were the ones who passed on their faith to Moses, Amram, and Jochebed, that we want to give them credit for that and say praise the Lord. So in verse 24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, because he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Lord, help us tonight as we look into your word. I pray that you would give us encouragement and joy, and help us, Lord, when we come along and need to make those really difficult decisions. Should we choose you? Should we choose walking with you, identifying with the people of God or the people of the world, that we would follow the example of Moses and choose God's people and walk with them. Help us now, Lord. I ask it in Jesus' name, amen. Maybe you remember seeing the movie Courageous. It's an interesting movie, a good movie. Enjoyed it very much, about 4 policemen and their choices to be godly leaders in their family. There's a subplot in the story, and it's about a man by the name of Javier. So if you can remember Javier, he was the Spanish or Latino immigrant who had brought his family to America, and he was struggling to feed the family. And in the story, in the movie, he was kind of a humorous individual, and he lost his job, and it was entirely heartbreaking for him that he was unemployed, and so he's looking for a job. And he receives a job in a warehouse, and he's managing in this warehouse shipping and receiving. Well, one day he's called into the office, and as he's called into the office to see about this new job or this new position, they tell him it's his if he will agree to tamper with the shipping receipts. So if 100 items go out, just write down, that 75 did, or whatever the numbers were. And he has a choice. And so he goes home and he's thinking, I need this job really bad, but I need to be a man of integrity. And so he had a choice to make. And in the account in the story, it's a great story again, he made a choice that he would do the right thing even if it cost him everything. And in the end, it didn't cost him. It resulted in him receiving a promotion, because they said, we put the same ethical dilemma in front of about 6 other people, and no one made the right choice. Now, the ethical dilemma that he faced, and I know it's a story, but it's a good one, in choosing to do the right thing rather than what would have given him what he would assume was a better job, is only a tiny, tiny, tiny illustration of the kinds of choices that Moses had. We have to enter into and think for a little bit how difficult of a choice it would have been for Moses to finally, in the process of time, as he's 40 years old, to decide he's going to walk away from everything. It wasn't just something. He walks away from everything, finds his family. We don't know how he found his family. Of course, they must have kept in contact. And he chooses to identify with a nation of slaves rather than be perhaps the next Pharaoh in Egypt. And the pharaohs, as you are aware, were considered to be sons of the gods. And so if you were both God and man, you would receive worship and you would receive accolades, and You never went hungry. You never had any need. In fact, in Egyptian history, we know about how the elites, quote unquote, the rich people, the royalty, that's the best word, the royalty lived amazingly wonderful lives. And so what he walked away from in abandoning Egypt, it says that in the last verse we read here, was virtually everything. And there's one more point about what he did that I want to make, and I won't make it again tonight, which is this. If what Moses did is infinitively or much greater than what Javier did in walking away from what he thought was a difficult situation, what Jesus did when he walked away from the throne of glory and came into a world of slaves, people bound by sin, to rescue his people, as Moses left Pharaoh's court to rescue his people, is absolutely tremendous, and it is a glorious thing. And even though Hebrews chapter 11 is not making that point about Christ, it is there. And we should see that as what Jesus did. So if you don't like history, you can take a rest for about 30 seconds or so. And if you do like history, you might want to get out a piece of paper. There's a few things that I would like to say that I think are interesting and helpful along the way, and they paint the picture. What we know about the time of Israel in Egypt is that Joseph went to Egypt, was sold into slavery about the year 1899 BC. So 1899, almost 1900 BC, he's down there, and he is there until 1876 BC, in which the rest of the family comes. So remember, BC, you work backwards, so the numbers are going to get smaller as we go. About 100 years after the family of Jacob went down to Egypt, Egypt was invaded. You might not be aware of this, but it really plays into our account. They were invaded by a group of Assyrians known as the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were a bunch of Asians. They came into the land of Egypt, and they took over. They ran the place for about 200 years. And because they were Asian, and because they were foreigners in the land of Egypt, they saw another group of people in Egypt as a big threat. And you know who that would be. The Hyksos, who were from Assyria, saw the Israelites, Jacob and Joseph and the family, as a big threat. And so they were the ones who began to enslave the nation of Israel. So it wasn't necessarily the Egyptians, it was the Hyksos. And when you read the account, when it says, "And in those days there arose a king in Egypt who knew not Joseph," the point is, this guy's a foreigner. He doesn't know their history. He doesn't recognize that Joseph rescued the whole nation, 7 years of good land and 7 years of bad land. And so they isolated the Israelis, the Jewish people, and turned them into slaves. And so the Hyksos were there for about 200 years before they finally threw them out. And so after they were thrown out, it was about 50 years before Moses was born, there was a king by the name of Thutmose, Thutmose, who was the one who began killing the babies. So as he killed many babies at the time of Moses, the year that Moses would have faced his almost extinction was literally, and what's so great about this is we know the year. You would say, well, how in the world do you know? It's not very hard. There's a little variation. Moses was placed in a basket in the year 1524 BC. Placed in the basket there, clearly in history. He was born in 1525, I hope I said 25, 1525 BC is when he was there. And he was adopted by a woman. We know her name too. I'd like to give that to you. Again, if you don't like history, you still got another minute, but we'll come back to me. Moses' stepmother's name was Hatshepsut, Hatshepsut. And so she was about 23 or 24 when she was down at the river taking a bath, doing her ceremonial cleansing, whatever it was, and she saw that little coffin floating in the reeds, little ark there, and she rescued him. A few years later, her husband dies, and they can't seem to find a person to be Pharaoh. The person who is ready, he's a little boy, and sometimes they had little children that they would be... they would ascend to the throne or whatever. But Moses' stepmother didn't like that idea. And so she took over. And she's one of two of the only Egyptian pharaohs who were actually ladies. So you didn't know that. Moses' stepmother, the one who rescued her from the swamp, from the reeds, actually ruled Egypt for 22 years. And as she ruled Egypt, any one of her children would have been eligible to be the next pharaoh. So does that tell you something about Moses? If she was an interloper, and she was, and if she had a favorite child who probably was Moses, the individual who was destined, or in line at least, to be the pharaoh would have been Moses himself. And so when the text says, and maybe you didn't notice this, that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, that was an official title of a person who was in line to be the Pharaoh. And so Moses didn't just give up a pretty posh existence, he gave up the ability to be Pharaoh himself. Well, the son that was installed, that, let me give you her name again, because you might even remember it over time, Hatshepsut. I know I wouldn't ever call my daughter that name. Their son, or the person who was installed, he finally came back to power, and she reigned for 22 years, and during that time, Moses was out doing his thing. We know that he was in training, he was in school, he was a general. Josephus, who wrote a great history of Israel, here's one of the things he says about Moses. During this 40-year time period that Moses became an expert general. And so he beat the Ethiopians in some kind of a major battle, and he was well known, and he was very well respected. Well, when this little boy gets to the throne, one of the things that he wants to do is he wants to take revenge, because there was a woman who took his place for 22 years. And so you know what you do in Egypt when you don't like the fact that someone did something in history? You strike their name from history. And so one of the persons, if you go to the tombs of the kings and queen, and you look for a picture, you'll find a picture of this woman, and her face has been destroyed. So they remove her from history, Moses' stepmother, from history. They attempted to by taking her off of every single monument. So enter Moses. Moses' stepmother has just been removed. The younger man who wanted to be Pharaoh comes into the picture. And here's Moses, who was in line to be the next Pharaoh. And he's about 40 years old. And he realizes it's time to make a change. And I believe that is exactly, well, we know it's within a year because we know how long Moses lived. We know about his 40 years and 40 years and 40 years. It was right at this time when he looked around and decided it was time for him to live by faith. And so he left the throne room, and he went out into Egypt and into the place where the children of Israel were, and he began to identify with them. And so I would like to give you tonight, come back everybody, if you're not interested in history, the history part is over. Come back and we're going to learn now some of the most important things that people who live by faith, what they do. Moses is a man who walked by faith, and his faith was absolutely wonderful. The first thing that we see in verses 24 is that people of faith love and identify with the people of God. He had a choice to make, and his choice was, should I be an Egyptian? Should I live in Egypt? Or should I go down and identify with the people that I really know are mine, the people that serve the true God? And he made a choice. He would rather live with slaves rather than be free with the Egyptians. Now, you might not think that that is a religious choice. It's like, well, should I live in Lance or Beriga? It's not that kind of a choice, because as Pharaoh, or as one who was in line to be Pharaoh, these people went to school, and school, and school, and school, and school, and school. And in fact, there was a school called the Prince's School. The Prince's School was the school that was arranged for people who were destined to be the next royalty and leaders and whatnot. And here's what they learned. They studied writing and reading and math and history and the decimal system and arithmetic and astronomy and geometry and science, and they studied medicine and music. They studied the act of war and what wisdom was, and they looked at natural law, and they studied justice and integrity and truth and philosophy, and they studied religion and morals and They were taught and believed that they were sons of the gods or Isis and Horus. And so anyone who was in that group of people, not only did you have to learn reading, writing, the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, you worshiped these deities. So for 40 years, Moses has been going to school, doing what he was required to do. And as he was there in school, he was trained, it says in the text, in all the wisdom of Egypt. He was probably the most educated man on the face of the earth at that time, at least in that region. And if he stayed there, he was saying, I believe in Horus. Horus is the God that I love because Horus is connected with my training and what I will be. And as the next Pharaoh in Egypt, I will give my devotion to Horus. And he couldn't continue or serve or worship the Egyptian deities any longer. And so he chose to leave and become a slave and identify with the people of God. First thing that it says, and by the way, in Acts chapter 7, it says that he went out to see his people. And then it says a little bit later in Acts chapter 7 when it describes him that he went out to visit his people. And the difference between seeing them and visiting them is when you see them, you're observing, you're learning, you're understanding, you're making decisions and investigations. But when he went out to visit them, and that's used in Acts 7:23. In fact, I'm going to ask you, because I've said this so many times over the years that somebody ought to be remembering this pretty soon. Whenever it says that the Lord has returned to visit his people, what does the Bible mean? And it's used multiple times. So here's Ruth and Naomi. They're down in the land of Moab. And they say, it's time for us to go back to Egypt because they heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. And so every time the Bible uses the word visit, it always means to come and help. So when the text says, and this is Acts chapter 7, verse 25, that Moses came to visit his people, it says he was deliberately coming to rescue them. What's the first thing he did, by the way, when he came to rescue his people, visit and help them? He went and he found somebody who was beating up an Israeli, and he killed the guy. And so that wasn't just in an act of rage, like, what are you guys doing? This is crazy. And he chopped off his head. He was there to be their deliverer. He had intended to do so. And he knew that as soon as he killed an Egyptian, that he was putting down a stake in the ground. He could never go back home again to his people, the Egyptians. He would always be identified with Israel. He went to see his people. He went to visit his people. And then we're told in verse 24, where we just read, that he went to join the people of Israel. And so one of the things I could learn from that is simply this. When you look at what the Egypt is in the Bible, and what the wilderness is in the Bible, and what the land of Israel is in the Bible, what do they represent? Egypt always represents the world, the past. The wilderness, when they were wandering for that 40 years, always represents the Christian life, the way that we walk, our time with God. And Canaan, Palestine, always represents heaven. And so just as Moses left Egypt and identified with the people of God, what do you think it is teaching you and me? That we need to leave the world, leave the things which are behind, and follow God and identify with the people of God. People of faith identify, as Moses did, with the people of God. That's why you're here tonight, by the way. You are identifying with the people of God. Second thing about people of God, those of faith, they accept present suffering for future glory. And that's what we read in the text, verse 25. I'm going to read it one more time. 11:25, choosing. So this wasn't accidental. It was his deliberate choice, choosing to suffer. Isn't that amazing? Choosing rather to suffer. None of us would say, I'm going to choose to suffer. But if you walk with God and you do the right thing in a difficult circumstance, not worrying about the consequences, you are choosing to suffer. And we have to do that. That's part of what the biblical faith is. Is choosing to suffer, rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin for a season. Here's what went through his mind. I can have temporary affliction now and future glory later, or I can have the passing pleasures of sin now and a lot more misery and no glory in heaven. Or I can have suffering now and pleasure later, or I can have pleasure now and suffering later. And so which one of the two did he choose? He chose the suffering now and the pleasure later, and the reason he did it is he was a pretty good person at math. And I don't even mean that tongue-in-cheek, but I do a little. When he compared the riches of Egypt with the riches of heaven, he realized that's a better deal. And when we go through trials and difficulties, and if we face persecution, and if we choose to go the hard way, God's way, whatever the case would be, we should do a little bit of math in our heads and say, which one will be of greater value? Paul says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 18 that I reckon that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. And he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And when he talks about that which is temporary versus that which is eternal, he says it's not like the rewards of heaven are a little bit better than whatever reward and pleasure and joy I might have now. He's saying that you can't even compare them. It's so important to see that. I reckon that they're not even worthy to be compared. It's like getting out a scale and you think you're going to put the pleasures of this life on one side of the scale, and then you're going to put the pleasures of heaven on the other side of the scale. And here's what you find out. The scale won't hold all of the pleasures of heaven that should be placed upon it. So when he says, I reckon that they're not worthy to be compared, heaven is so much greater than earth. Our future pleasure and joy is so much greater than any joy we could ever have here and now, that it is a no-brainer to live for God. Think about that. It really is a no-brainer to do what is right, because you will be so much more happy if you do. I was counseling somebody in a situation, and I told them, I know that this seems hard, but this will make you happier than anything you've ever done in the here and now if you just do it God's way. That is absolutely the case. And so people of faith, as Moses was walking by faith, they accept present sufferings for future glory. That's what he was able to do. And if you think about it, I want to remind you about that a little bit. When they found King Tut's tomb, he was just a younger pharaoh. They said, I'll give you some of the numbers here. They said that his face mask alone was worth $1 million. And when they looked at everything that was in his tomb, I'm sorry, it wasn't 1 million, it was 13 million. And when they looked at everything that was in his tomb, just the stuff they stuffed in his grave, it was worth over $1 billion. And so if they were willing to pour out $1 billion to bury a pharaoh, how much money would a person who was a Moses as a pharaoh, should he become a pharaoh, received on a daily basis? He would have had all of the treasures of Egypt. In fact, when it talks about him turning his back on the treasures of Egypt, that was actually a term for what the pharaoh owned, because who owned everything? Pharaoh owned all of Egypt. He was the owner, because he was the God. He was the king. He was the pharaoh. And that's what Moses turned away from. And so people of faith are those who accept present realities, present sufferings for future glory later. Number 3, people of faith like Moses in verse 26 treasure the reproach of Christ as worth more and as a greater privilege and satisfaction than the treasures of this world. Now let's read 26 and see that again. Here is how he was able to make his choice in 25. So he made a choice in 25, and now we get the motive for that choice in verse 26. You see how those are connected there? We're told what he did, choosing, first word of 25. The first word of 26 is esteeming. He made his choice based on his values. And this was what he saw was a greater value. He esteemed the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Now think about that for just a second. We're talking about here. Paul says in 1 Corinthians something that helps us to understand that. He says the foolishness of God is what? The foolishness of God is wiser than men. And then he says that the weakness of God is stronger than men. So if you could think of the most dumb thought, if God could ever have a dumb thought, the dumbest thought God could ever think of would be too brilliant for Einstein to understand. I mean, just if you think of dumb categories. Or the weakest thing that God could ever find to do would be stronger than Atlas and all of us combined together because he is strong. And so I want to use that same analogy and say the most shameful thing about Jesus Christ is more glorious than any glory that we could imagine. If his foolishness is wiser than men, if his weakness is stronger than men, then the shamefulness of Christ, if there is any shame of Christ, is more wonderful than any glory we could ever know. And so this is how Moses walked out of the palace. This is how he left behind the possibility of being the Pharaoh. This is how he left behind all of the ease that he experienced and being able to have his name chiseled into stone and maybe even have a pyramid built for him or enter into the tombs of the kings down in Lower Egypt along the way. He just simply added up everything and he says, this is more glorious than that could ever be. Jesus, Christ, knowing the Lord, is more glorious and more wonderful than anything I could never own or know or love or experience in this world. And I want to ask you a question. Is that true or not true? And it's kind of rhetorical, isn't it? Of course it's true. So if it's true that Jesus is more precious and more wonderful and a greater treasure than anything this world could ever offer, why is it so hard to choose him? Why is it so hard to do the things that are right when, as was it George Beverly Shea? I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. I'd rather have him than treasures untold. If we could just see and understand who Christ is and how precious he is, we would find it easy to make the right choice. If I took two boxes for you and put them up here, and I told you that one is filled with spinach and the other is filled with chocolate, but you don't know which is which, you might have a hard time choosing. But if I put a window in them, and you could tell which one had the chocolate in it, it would be an easy choice. Our problem is not that we're unwilling to make choices. Our problem is we can't really see. We can't understand. We can't see those things which are invisible. Now let me remind you of what we learned in verse 1 of Hebrews 11. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things of what? Things which are unseen. Now let's read the end of verse 26 and see how it was that he chose it. He esteemed, verse 26, the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt because he looked to the reward. And the reward is nothing other than Jesus himself. He saw Jesus. He saw how much more precious Jesus was. And so maybe if you want to make it out as an analogy, he drew a picture and he says, here's Egypt on the left, and here's Jesus on the right. And he would have thought of him as the Lord at the time. He didn't have all of the information that we have in the Old Testament. And I can either choose the Lord and have him as my own and live in his kingdom forever, or I can live in the kingdom of Egypt for 100 years. And it was a no-brainer because he had what? He had the eyes of faith to see the reward, and the reward was the Lord Jesus. And I want to quote verse 1 again because I want you to live by faith. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. If I could only by faith, get a vision of Christ, it would be so much easier to live, do what's right, make good choices, always walk with the Lord, tell others about him, be pleasing to him every day, if the Lord would open our eyes to see Christ. That's how we did it. Go ahead. I'm ready for any comments.
Okay. There's a real correlation between what you're talking about and the churches in Canada and what they're going
Oh,
through
yeah,
right now.
yeah.
And we may very well
Yeah. So the church that was fined $300,000, they might say, is that all? You don't know what you're trying to keep me from. You're trying to keep me away from Christ, and he's worth more than that. Absolutely. I was riding in a car with a good friend of mine, Tim Sigler. He's now our missionary when we were in college. And he was going way too fast down the street, and he had this little 3-cylinder Chevy Geo Sprint or something like that. I mean, it was at least 2 tin cans. And he ran into like a 1955 Chevy Bel Air. And it was boom. And the other car didn't even move. I don't even think the chrome scraped off the bumper. But it completely totaled the little car that we were in.
What year was this?
Yeah, way back then. So 30 years ago. It was like 80, 87, 88. And I laughed and I says, you know, Tim, the Lord is willing to spend this car to make you a better person. And the Lord's grown him a lot, of course, since then. But the Lord's willing to do those things in our lives. Any other comments about Moses and his time? And we'll be done for the night. Okay, let's just go to prayer and ask that the Lord would open our eyes to see the truth of reality. Lord, we know that the things which are seen are temporary. They're going to melt, they're going to rot, they're going to burn, they're going to decay. But the things which are not seen, those are the things that last forever. And those are the things that we should be investing in, and we can invest in them and choose them if we could only have eyes of faith. And I'm convinced it would be a lot easier to walk by faith if we could see more clearly the things that you have prepared for us. Eye has not seen and ear has not heard, nor has it even entered into the heart of man the things that you have prepared for those, reserved for those who are yours. Help us to see and believe. And help us, Lord, if we go to choose the world, to take a second look at Christ and see him as more valuable. And then not have to choose what makes no sense to us, but then instead choose what makes the most sense, choosing the inexpressible, incalculable riches of Christ. I thank you for Moses and his faith. Pray that you'd help us to walk by faith too. We ask it.